Hello everyone and welcome back to another video here on the Xisuma Says channel. I've got some food for thought for you around a topic that's kind of old news. This was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and when I first heard this news I initially had kind of like a good reaction to it, and then I spent some time really thinking it over, and I still feel quite positively about this. So what's happening in the tech world is that there are terminology and terms inside of computer programming that are going to be changed, and certain companies are doing this. GitHub is one of them. The database people, MySQL, and also Twitter have been out there saying that they're going to change this terminology. Now, there are two sets of terminology that are currently being brought up. The term master and slave, and the other one is blacklist and whitelist. So master and slave is something I actually learned about when I was a little kid, tinkering around with my dad's computer, and we had 2 hard drives and we had to pull them out and change some pins, and my dad was explaining how you had to tell the hard drive it was the master or the slave because one of the hard drives had to be the primary one and the other one had to be the secondary one. Now, blacklist and whitelist we probably all know quite commonly from playing online games like on a server, and if you get blacklisted you can't enter, and if you're whitelisted you can if there is like an open door close policy. Now, these uses of language have negative connotations. Now, black and white are colors. They're also tones of skin as well. And so I can understand how people feel a little more contentious around that one. However, master and slave is pretty strong terminology there linked to masters and slaves. I'm not really sure if there is another origin source for that use of language, but that is pretty much coming from slavery. And so my initial reaction was that this was a good idea, and I had to think it through to explain myself. So I want to talk on the use of language and intent and context. So I think these things are really important. Personally, I believe in freedom of speech. Everyone should have the right to say whatever they want. And also when certain things are being said, we should look at the context and look at the intention. Now, when I was growing up, there were certain words like retard, for example, which were quite commonly used, and over time, that language has changed. Now, the context of me saying it and the intent there is simply to inform you and use the word to explain what I'm talking about. If I were perhaps playing with someone else and I called them a retard, that would obviously be going into offensive territory. And so the use of this word has changed over time. It used to be common, it wasn't considered offensive, and then people started to use it in offensive nature. And, we kind of, as a whole, I guess, agreed or maybe disagreed on it, but the general tone has shifted to not using that word and that it's generally considered an insult and something you shouldn't say now. And that's the nature of language. It changes over time. It's amorphic and it's constantly updating and evolving. So when we decide that some words now have different meanings and that you shouldn't say them, I can understand when people get defensive about it because they may be used to using it. Perhaps an older generation still uses that word and it doesn't have the same meaning for some of us that are younger and know the word differently. So I think for that reason, intent and context is important in language. However, when the language is structural or institutionalized, when it's part of something that doesn't revolve around a person's use of intent or the context, well, context does to some extent, but there is no intent in programming language. It is essentially neutral. It's not a person with feelings who might have said a word that upsets someone else, yet they never meant to. And to me, it seems just like a really good idea to minimize the amount of contentious language inside of things like programming. I believe very much that we all have biases, and the word subliminal could often be associated with some form of intent. Something is trying to subliminally influence you. But I think everything we encounter and interact with influences us, sometimes in large ways, sometimes in minuscule ways. But if we're going to interact with technology and language in a way where it's full of words, I mean, just imagine throwing in some offensive words into the middle of coding language, right? There's no need for it to be there. There's no need for it to be offensive, but it could essentially be the words you use to instruct the computer what to do. And so in that case, without that language being a person having intent, it almost makes sense to remove as many of these things as possible and make the language around something like programming neutral, because when we interact with it, it is influencing us. It is influencing our thoughts. And reading master and slave doesn't make you a racist, and neither does whitelist or blacklist. But, those biases, those subconscious ones, they could be there. And maybe changing this would make no difference whatsoever. And maybe it would make a tiny bit of difference, but surely it couldn't make a negative difference to remove language like master and slave and blacklist and whitelist. And there are good alternatives. Like I said at the beginning of this video, primary and secondary can be used instead of master and slave, although maybe actually there are different systems that use that language, but we can always invent new words. I mean, all words in language are invented, right? Someone had to speak them first. And blacklist and whitelist obviously refers to color and not race, but we could simply say, I had to think on that on a second. I thought of some alternative terms the other day, and then they didn't just come straight back to mind here. So blocklist would be one, you are blocked instead of black. And then allow list instead of whitelist, because you are allowed in or unblocked, etc. There are alternative words that we could use, and I think it makes sense to remove them, and when doing so, just to have an open discussion about why it's being done. Because this is language, because it's not a person, it doesn't feel like it's censorship. It feels like it's smart to go, we interact with this, let's change it, let's make it different for the better of everyone. So I thought I'd stop and think for a moment here if there was anything else I wanted to add to this. And I tried to look up some of the hashtags that were trending a couple of weeks ago, looking for some alternative opinions, and I couldn't find them, but I remembered a couple of things along the way. So there are other terms that are now being called into question that may not even relate to programming, like man hours was one of them, grandfathering, dummy value. I mean, we can always assess and review the language we use, and I don't really have an opinion on those ones yet because I'm not really sure where exactly they're going to be brought into the picture. But one of the big complaints that I think was interesting is how this might actually mess up computer systems, because these terminologies are very old and deeply rooted in some sort of computer systems here and there, especially the master-slave thing. If some computers even still use that, I'm not entirely sure. But it could be a huge effort and a costly one to go around changing old programming languages, and it could introduce bugs and problems for the sake of changing the language used there. And I think that's actually a fair point to make. Maybe it should be about new systems moving forward and being smart with how we change things moving into the future, and potentially not break old systems over this, but not being, the most involved tech person or tech person at all, really. I understand some of this stuff. I can't really comment too much on how systems are going to be affected by that, but I'm sure there are some people out there in the know who have an idea of what kind of impact changing these things is going to have on these systems, and it will be interesting to see what exactly happens in the future. But those are all of my thoughts on this for now, and I hand it over to you to discuss it in the comments down below. As always, I encourage you to be civil with one another, which is something that seems to just happen anyway when I go and look at the comments, which is always fantastic to see. So thank you everyone for the discussion, thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon in another one. Bye bye.